Today, 9th of January 2005, the first Teisho for the new year. We're going to take up the subject of the tsunami that happened 2 weeks ago in the Indian Ocean. What can we learn from it? Such catastrophic events always raise questions for people. There was a little article in the Herald by a journalist who'd put the words God and tsunami into Google, and he came up with 800,000 hits. So clearly it has inspired a lot of people to question, perhaps more so this time because of its timing right after Christmas. And the kind of question that comes up for believers in God is, what kind of a God could allow such a thing to happen? Well, in Buddhism we don't have a God concept. We don't ascribe to an all-merciful, all-powerful deity to whom we look for protection. But it still doesn't let us off the hook in coming to terms with such violent cataclysms where there is so much suffering. So in this talk I want to look at what actually happened and see what we can learn from that. But I'd like to preface this investigation by saying that what we talk about this morning is not meant for the victims. It's meant for us who are safe here and regarding this event at some distance. Victims don't need words. They need concrete help, shelter, food, comforting arms. They have to do their own work of coming to terms with an event such as this that completely turns their lives upside down. But we're called upon to face such events as well, and that's what this talk is going to be about. Start by looking at what happened physically. And there's much to be learned from this. In Zen we don't separate the material and spiritual realms. There is just this one reality. So, what happened? Well, on the 26th of December, at about 58 minutes after midnight, Greenwich Mean Time, so it was about 8 a.m. local time, an earthquake occurred along the 1,000-kilometre fault line off the coast of Sumatra, where the Eurasian and the Australian tectonic plates meet. It was a massive quake, 9 on the Richter scale. The sea floor ruptured and the seabed was vertically jolted. One scientist said it was as if there was a big paddle on the ocean floor that had suddenly been pushed up. This upheaval displaced hundreds of cubic kilometers of water, and huge waves fanned out in 2 directions across the Indian Ocean, pretty much along a north-south axis. And these waves created destruction for the next 7 hours as they intersected with land. It took only 15 minutes for the wave to reach Sumatra. These waves were going at 800 kilometers an hour. Incredible speed. After 30 minutes, the waves hit the Andaman Islands. After 90 minutes, Sri Lanka. In 2 hours, they reached Thailand. In 3, the Maldives. And after 7 hours, they hit the coast of Africa. You get some sense of what a huge global event this was from the fact that geophysicists at NASA were able to detect the Earth spinning on its axis microseconds faster than it usually does. and the whole Earth actually tilted 2.5 centimeters on its axis. It's amazing to think that we can measure such minute changes, but apparently we can. The reason why these waves are so destructive is that out at sea they're quite shallow, but when they're not very high, that is, but when they reach coastal waters, they simultaneously slow down and increase in height. It's a bit like a pile-up of cars on a motorway. If the front car stops, there's all this energy in the cars behind that, and they keep going fast, and so they end up piling up on top of the cars in front. And what happens when the water reaches shallower areas is that the front of the wave slows down, but the back of the wave keeps going fast. And so it builds up, it piles up into this huge wave. There's nowhere for the water to go but up. So in some places, there was a wave 2 stories high. Just imagine how frightening it would be to be facing such a wave. 10 meters or 30 feet, more than 30 feet. And not just one wave, but several intervals between about 5 and 40 minutes. At one place in Sri Lanka, the water from the waves reached a whole kilometer inland. In many places there was very, very little warning. Most places actually none, except for the receding of the tide, hundreds of meters out, the seabed left exposed. And at that point, people had maybe 10 or 15 minutes to flee. Further inland, if you weren't right at the beach, then the only warning would be this almighty roar, which some people thought, when they heard it, they thought it was a terrorist attack of some kind. So that's the basic mechanics of this event. Why did this catastrophe happen? Well, the why is right there already in the what, to some degree at least. But we need to look more closely. Basic fact is earthquakes happen when the plates that make up the Earth's surface suddenly move against each other. A tension builds up between these great bits of the Earth's crust, and something has to give. And so there's a slippage, one way or another. And the tsunamis happen when the plates in question are under the sea, when there's water on top. Volcanic eruptions sometimes also cause tsunamis. There were big tsunamis after the great explosion of Krakatoa, Indonesia. So these events happen because of the dynamics of our Earth, its basic makeup. What we live on, these tectonic plates, are like islands floating on the surface of the Earth. One scientist, in explaining this, he held up an apple and he said, the Earth's crust is like the skin on this apple. It's very thin. Underneath it is a seething mass of molten rock, the magma. So we human beings and all the other sentient beings on this earth are, to use an old expression, skating on thin ice. We're living on this unstable crust above this seething mass of molten rock. Scientists have also used the analogy of boiled milk. You know what it's like after you boil milk, you get this skin on the surface. that moves around with the liquid underneath. That's how delicate this world we live on is. This crust is not separate from the center of the earth. This great heated mass, it's extremely dense matter. At the point where these plates meet, sometimes the crust, the surface part, the plate will sink down and be reabsorbed into this molten lava. Or at times the mantle, this lava rises up through the cracks and spills out. That's volcanic activity. We in Auckland live on formations that have come out of such activity. Everything around us here in Auckland is evidence of this life process of our earth. And sometime within the next 1,000 years, there'll be another eruption. We don't know when, but judging from the history of our land here, that will happen at some point. So this earth we live on is unstable. It's full of tension. But it's this very tension and dynamic quality that gives life to everything. If it weren't for this instability, there would be no human beings and no other sentient beings existing at all. You have to go a little bit further back into the history of the Earth and the solar system to just understand this, why this is so. It turns out that life on this planet is a function of its size. Physicists talk of two different kinds of bonds which are active in the universe. You have gravitational bonds and electromagnetic bonds. Gravitational bonds are the attraction between different masses. And electromagnetic bonds are the attraction between different parts of atoms. And they're what hold together atoms into molecules. So you have these two types of attraction working in the universe. With gravity, it gets stronger when there's more mass. When there's more stuff, then gravity is stronger. And that's so in a planet, it gets stronger as you get closer to the center, because there's more pressure. Electromagnetic forces work differently. You have positive and negative charges, which make up atoms, and they don't get stronger in the same way. They bind things together. But the bigger planets have more gravity, more gravitational pressure, and the smaller planets have less. And when the solar system was born, all the planets in our solar system began evolving and growing and developing. But in the end, only this planet, the Earth, has produced life as we know it. Of course, we don't know everything about the other planets, and maybe we'll discover things on the other planets which we could call life. But I think it's fair to say that the Earth has developed incredible complexity in its life forms compared with the other planets. And we can take two planets to give us examples which throw light on just how extraordinary it is that life exists at all on our particular planet. One example is Mars, which is smaller than Earth, and there all the chemical creativity got choked off fairly early on, because there the bonds between atoms won out against the gravitational forces. So the crust, where we have a very thin crust here on Earth, on Mars the crust got thicker and thicker. So Mars is rock, solid rock, all the way through. iron and other types of rock. So the strength of those bonds just kind of choked everything off, and you end up with this big piece of rock, basically. On Jupiter, which is much more large than Earth, you have the opposite happening. Huge gravitational forces on Jupiter meant that molecules beyond the simplest just couldn't hold together. They would just get pulled apart by gravity. So on Jupiter it's mostly gas. Then Jupiter never even got to create rocks, let alone more differentiated and complex forms of life. But here on Earth, because of our size, you've got a balance between gravity and electrical forces. These two different reactions are held in a kind of tension. And so we have this thin, solidified crust where the molecules hold together, and this huge churning activity at the center. We actually live on a semi-liquid planet. A liquid that is flowing and boiling, not static at all. At a certain point in our history, this seething mass exuded huge amounts of water vapor out of its surface. And then later on, when things cooled down, the water vapor condensed and became our oceans. It was in these oceans that the earliest life forms happened. So in a very real way, we are the children of the oceans. We're the children of the molten rock, of these shifting plates on which we build our houses and our lives, and of the great oceans. Through this examination, we can begin to see how earthquakes and surges in this great ocean that gave birth to us are unavoidable. They're part and parcel of who we are as human beings. We can begin to see that we live in a world that is inherently violent and unstable. You can look at Mars, which is solid rock most of the way through, if not all the way through. And it's extremely slow in its development, if not entirely dead. I couldn't say anything is entirely dead. But its time frames are slowed right down, dormant in a sense, full of possibilities, but not much happening there. But here on Earth, we have life. And there's no life without this tension and instability and impermanence. Life is impermanence. Life is loss. That's what our Earth is constantly teaching us through such devastating events as earthquakes and tsunamis and other things, and through many of its other creations. It's constantly pointing out to us the first noble truth. Life is dukkha. This word dukkha is usually translated as suffering or unsatisfactoriness or sometimes misery. But if we go back to its roots, this word dukkha is related to the word that is used when a wheel has an axle which is off-center. So another way of thinking of dukkha is out of kilter, out of whack. But when we examine the way our whole earth works, we can begin to understand that there can only be life when things are out of kilter. Because it's when things are unstable, when there's a tension between 2 points, that things flow, that things are transformed. There can only be creation, movement, development, when there is destruction. Because the creation has to come out of something. So the Buddha really meant it when he said that life is suffering. Sometimes this is said as the unenlightened life is suffering. And that certainly, it's true that certain aspects of dukkha, of suffering, of misery, can be completely transcended when one is enlightened. But there are other aspects of suffering, these more primal ones that we're talking about here in terms of the nature of life, which even in an enlightened person, if that person is living, if that person has a body, then there's no way that those aspects of dukkha can be avoided. If an enlightened person is caught up in a tsunami, that person will die, may die, depending on causes and conditions. It's the nature of life. This fundamental kind of dukkha is transcended by the enlightened person only through uniting completely with that loss. Loss cannot be avoided. But by completely uniting oneself with the loss, then it becomes no loss. There's nothing separate from the loss. As we think about it, if you're swept up by a tsunami, you don't really have any choice but to embrace it. It's embraced you. But then there's this whole other aspect of dukkha. All that we add to the fundamental experience of loss that comes with life. Terrified by even the prospect of loss, we human beings shut down. We clamp and clench and get tense and try to grasp at security. And that we really can do something about. Interesting that the word terror for extreme fear is related to the word terra, the Latin word for the earth. So often our deepest fears are to do with this awesome power of the earth, which can, just by flicking its tail, so to speak, can wipe us out. Stephen Batchelor points out this in his book, Living with the Devil. He says, the very earth that can leave you dumb with wonder as you contemplate its selfless unfolding will destroy you with neither malice nor mercy should its tectonic plates shift beneath your feet. sublimely indifferent to our hopes and fears, life snuffs us out at death, no matter how tenaciously we cling to it. We're terrified by this impersonal force that has so little regard for us as individuals. Shantideva, the great writer of the Way of the Bodhisattva, he said, "The independable Lord of Death waits not for things to be done or undone. Whether sick or healthy, this fleeting life cannot be trusted." This fleeting life cannot be trusted. We can't rely on it to be a certain way. And yet, it's the only life we have. Okay, you might say, we can accept that. We can accept that these disasters are a part of life. But why did so many children have to die? And why did these people have to die? And why were these saved? This is something that often will come up for survivors or parents who survive, whose children die. Extreme pain of asking, why did they have to die? Why couldn't I have died? Children, in a very real sense, are closer to death than adults. They're more vulnerable. Their lungs are smaller. Their arms and legs don't have the same stamina. It's unlikely that they know how to swim. And so they're often the first to be gobbled up by these enormous forces. But why is one child saved and another perishes? The most honest answer that we can give to this question is that we just don't know. Of course, if we cling to the doctrine of our faith, we could certainly say this child dies because it's his or her karma to die. But what does that really mean? What karma means is that things all have a cause. So saying that somebody dies because of their karma is really just saying that they died because causes and conditions led them to die. Or they survived because causes and conditions allowed them to survive. Karma is counted among the 5 imponderables in Buddhism. Among one of the things that is deeply, deeply complex and mysterious. It doesn't really provide us with easy answers. It's no doubt that with more awareness, the death toll could have been lower in this disaster. It's unlikely that much could have been done in Sumatra, where there was only 15 minutes between the earthquake and the waves. But elsewhere, if people had been more attentive, many, many, many lives could have been saved. There's one little story in the Herald about some divers, New Zealand divers, off a beach in Thailand. They were diving deep and they noticed suddenly the visibility went from about 20 meters down to about 2 meters. And they realized there must have been something happening, that some kind of a wave was going through. But they had no idea out there in the deep water just what was happening. And so they actually just kept on diving for the rest of the day. When they got home, they found their wives and children were safe. And the reason they were safe was because the police had cleared this particular beach. Very little notice has been given to this, but it's quite a sobering thought that the message must have got through in some form to these beaches in Thailand, but there was only one beach where the police took the message seriously and cleared the beach. There's some thought that perhaps nothing was done because there was fear what it would do to the tourist trade. So here we see how lack of awareness turns into something more sinister. Of course, tourism has been damaged so much more by the thousands and thousands of deaths that occurred because there wasn't a response to the warnings. People in Hawaii knew 15 minutes after the earthquake that there could be these huge waves, and they actually did try to contact the countries involved where they thought this might happen. It says they sent alerts to 26 countries, including Thailand and Indonesia, but struggled to reach the right people. We tried to do what we could, said the centre's director, Charles McCreary. We don't have any contacts in our address book for anybody in that particular part of the world. Just imagine what these people are going through now in examining themselves about what more could we have done? What an agonizing place it must be for them. Knowing now just how much devastation there has been. Equally on the coast of Africa, where there was 7 hours between the earthquake and the waves. In Kenya, the police cleared the beaches, but that's the only place. Everywhere else, nothing happened and hundreds of people died. The worst was Somalia, which is, of course, in the grips of war as well. And certainly there were warning signs in many places. One of the most interesting reports was about the Yala Wildlife Park in Sri Lanka. People thought going in that they would find huge numbers of drowned animals, but they didn't. Of 250 tourist vehicles that entered the park on that day, only 30 came back. So most of the people in the park perished. But the animals didn't. Sensing something, we don't know what, there's been speculations over what might have been the spark for these animals moving, but they sensed something and they moved to higher ground and they were saved. Many other stories, similar things. Elephants in Thailand at a certain resort cried and cried until their hoots with the tourists who were being given rides moved away from the beaches. The elephants who weren't working, who were chained up, broke their heavy chains in order to flee. Also, in the Andaman Islands, there are some very ancient tribes living in the bush, and these islands are fairly low, and there was fears that these tribes would have been wiped out. In fact, they weren't. Tribal people live with a great deal of presence in their environment. They were able to read the warning signs, perhaps the movements of animals, and they also moved away from the coasts. Apparently in their mythology there are stories of shrinking islands. So perhaps hundreds of years ago there may have been, or repeatedly over thousands of years, there may have been these waves, and the memory of them is preserved in their culture. We modern industrial people have stopped living in our places. We're not sensitive to these signs and warnings and wisdom that comes out of living for a long time in one place. a little item by the Friends of the Earth pointing out that the destruction of mangrove forests and coral reefs made the effects of the tsunami much worse in many places. Mangrove forests and coral reefs have been replaced by hotels, and highways and developments. I'd like to end by just taking a few moments to return to the suffering that such a cataclysmic event causes. On the television there was a film of returning victims. One was a young British tourist, she was probably about 20, who came in at the airport and was interviewed, and she was weeping because a fellow tourist, young woman, had asked if she could hold her hand, and she refused, she said she knew that if they held hands they'd both be dragged down. All she could think of now was watching this other girl sink into the water and drown. Another story was of a woman with 5 little children under about 5, and her terrible dilemma as the wave approached: which one do I pick up? In the end, all 5 children drowned. There's a similar story in the sutras about Pattakara, who became one of the early disciples of the Buddha, who, to cut a long story short, was crossing a river with her 2 children, and she'd just given birth to the second child. She was very weak, so she couldn't cross with both of them. So she left the older child on the bank. She carried her baby across this raging, flooding river, put him down on the far side, and then started to go back for the older child. And as she was going back, an eagle came down and plucked up her baby off the shore. She couldn't do anything. She was in the middle of the river, and she started screaming and screaming. And her older child on the farther bank thought he was being called, and so he came and jumped into the river to go to her, and of course was drowned. Earlier, she'd found her husband already dead from a snake bite. After this, she returned home to find that the flood had completely destroyed her parents' home, and her parents and her brother were also dead. She became crazed at all this loss, and eventually came before the Buddha in a state of derangement. He spoke these words to her: "The 4 oceans contain but a little water compared to all the tears that we have shed, smitten by sorrow, bewildered by pain. Why, O woman, are you still heedless?" All the water of these great waves that struck the coasts around the Indian Ocean, these hundreds of cubic kilometers of water, cannot be compared to the tears that have been shed over the eons by people suffering great loss. This is the nature of the world in which we live. I'll finish with another passage from Living with the Devil by Stephen Batchelor. When the stubborn, frozen solidity of necessary cells and things is dissolved in this perspective of emptiness, a contingent world opens up that is fluid and ambiguous, fascinating and terrifying. Not only does this world unfold before us with awesome subtlety, complexity and majesty, one day it will swallow us up in its tumultuous wake, along with everything else we cherish. The infinitely poignant beauty of creation is inseparable from its diabolic destructiveness. How to live in such a turbulent world with wisdom, tolerance, empathy, care and non-violence is what saints and philosophers have struggled over the centuries to articulate. What is striking about the Buddhist approach is that rather than positing an immortal or transcendent self that is immune to the vicissitudes of the world, Buddha insisted that salvation lies in discarding such consoling fantasies and embracing instead the very stuff of life that will destroy you. We'll stop here and recite the 4 vows.